Green hydrogen is often presented as a technology problem. Better electrolyzers, cheaper stacks, larger factories, more subsidies. But when you strip the narrative down to what actually decides whether projects reach final investment decision and survive into operations, the answer is far less glamorous. The real filter is the power grid, not in theory, not in policy statements, but in physical constraints, market rules, and time delays that no press release can bypass. The grid does not negotiate. It either works for your project, or your project quietly dies long before hydrogen is ever produced. Every green hydrogen project is, at its core, a large industrial electricity consumer. A 100 megawatt electrolyzer plant is not a pilot. It is equivalent to adding a mid-sized industrial city to the grid. A gigawatt-scale hydrogen hub rivals the peak load of entire metropolitan regions. The grid was not designed for this kind of sudden, concentrated demand, especially when it is tied to variable renewable generation. This mismatch between how hydrogen wants to operate and how grids are built is the reality that decides survival. Developers often discover this problem too late. On paper, renewable capacity exists. Wind farms are spinning, solar fields stretch to the horizon, and spreadsheets show clean electrons available at attractive prices. But electricity existing somewhere on the grid is not the same as electricity being accessible at the point, time, and conditions a hydrogen plant requires. Capacity does not equal access, and access does not equal reliability. The grid enforces those distinctions ruthlessly. Before a hydrogen project can move forward, it must pass through interconnection studies that examine whether transmission lines, substations, and regional stability can support the load. This is not a formality. In many regions, these studies reveal that the grid is already saturated. Even if generation exists, the wires to move that power do not. When that happens, the project is required to fund transmission upgrades. Those upgrades are not marginal costs. They can add tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, years of permitting, and layers of regulatory risk that investors do not tolerate lightly. This is where many hydrogen projects quietly stall. They are not canceled in dramatic fashion. They are delayed, reevaluated, or restructured. The public still hears announcements, but internally, the grid has already delivered its verdict. Without guaranteed interconnection on acceptable timelines and costs, financing collapses. Banks do not finance uncertainty, and equity does not wait indefinitely for electrons. The grid's second filter is utilization. Hydrogen economics depend heavily on how many hours per year an electrolyzer can operate. High utilization drives lower levelized cost of hydrogen. Low utilization does the opposite. Grid operators, however, often require large, flexible loads to reduce consumption during peak demand or congestion events. From a grid stability perspective, this makes sense. From a hydrogen economics perspective, it is devastating. Every forced shutdown, curtailment, or operating restriction reduces output while fixed costs remain unchanged. The result is hydrogen that looks affordable in early models but becomes uncompetitive in real operation. This is why many projects that technically interconnect still struggle to reach bankability. They are grid-connected, but grid-constrained. There is a fundamental tension here. Grids value flexibility. Hydrogen plants value stability. Grids are optimized to prevent overloads, maintain frequency, and protect infrastructure. Hydrogen plants are optimized to amortize capital over as many operating hours as possible. Unless the market compensates electrolyzers for providing grid services, this tension becomes a structural disadvantage for hydrogen. Transmission expansion is often presented as the solution, but it introduces its own survival filter. Transmission projects are slow. They involve land access, environmental reviews, community opposition, and regulatory approvals that routinely take 5 to 10 years. Hydrogen project timelines are usually far shorter. Developers plan for offtake by 2030, sometimes earlier. Transmission rarely moves at that pace. This timing mismatch is lethal. A hydrogen plant cannot wait a decade for wires. If transmission is not already planned, permitted, and funded, the hydrogen project becomes speculative. Investors know this. Utilities know this. Grid operators know this. The project's fate is often sealed the moment transmission requirements are revealed. Some regions have recognized this reality and adapted. Where hydrogen survives, it is not because electrolyzers are better, but because grids are structured to accommodate them. These grids share common characteristics. They have high renewable penetration that regularly produces surplus energy. They have market mechanisms that reward large flexible loads for absorbing excess supply. They have proactive transmission planning that anticipates industrial electrification rather than reacting to it. In these environments, hydrogen does not fight the grid, it complements it. Electrolyzers become controllable demand assets that stabilize prices and reduce curtailment. Instead of being punished for flexibility, hydrogen plants are compensated for it. This compensation is not optional. Without it, hydrogen absorbs all the downside risk while the grid captures the benefits. Curtailment is often cited as hydrogen's opportunity. When wind or solar is curtailed, hydrogen can convert otherwise wasted electricity into molecules. But curtailment is not free energy. Grid rules often prioritize generator compensation over load incentives. Hydrogen plants may not receive power at prices low enough to offset their lost utilization. In some cases, they are simply excluded from accessing curtailed energy altogether. This reveals a deeper truth. Hydrogen success is not determined by how much renewable energy exists, but by how grid rules allocate value. If hydrogen is treated as just another load, it loses. If it is treated as infrastructure that provides system-level benefits, it survives. The grid decides which interpretation applies. This grid reality is rarely visible in public discourse. Maps show renewable potential. Announcements list electrolyzer capacities, but the true constraints live in interconnection queues, congestion studies, and transmission plans that few outside the utility world ever read. By the time the public learns a project is in trouble, the grid made its decision years earlier. This is why so many green hydrogen projects fail before final investment decision. Not because hydrogen does not work, but because it collides with power systems that were never designed for it. The grid is not hostile, it is indifferent. It enforces physics, capacity limits, and operational risk without regard for climate ambition or industrial policy. As hydrogen scales, this grid reality becomes more severe, not less. Early projects can sometimes find favorable niches. Large-scale deployment cannot. When multiple hydrogen plants compete for the same transmission corridors and renewable resources, only those aligned with grid planning survive. The rest becomes stranded ideas. This is the uncomfortable truth behind the hydrogen hype cycle. The grid is not a supporting character, it is the judge. It decides which projects reach steel in the ground, which operate reliably, and which never move beyond announcements. Understanding this reality is no longer optional for developers, investors, or policymakers. Hydrogen strategies that ignore grid constraints are not ambitious. They are incomplete. Survival belongs to projects that treat the grid as a first-order design variable, not a downstream utility problem. This is where serious project evaluation begins. Not with electrolyzer selection, not with subsidy stacking, but with grid access, utilization economics, and transmission timelines. Everything else is secondary. If green hydrogen is going to move from hype to industrial reality, it will be because projects are built where the grid allows them to survive. Not everywhere, not at scale everywhere, but in the places where electrons, infrastructure, and markets align. That is the grid reality that decides which green hydrogen projects survive.